In this video, I'm going to go through 10 myths that I hear very often said about watercolour painting. Are they true? Are they false? Or is the truth somewhere in between? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching me, my name is Michelle, and on this channel you'll find watercolour, mixed media, drawing tips and techniques, as well as business, social media and online selling tips for artists. So please do consider subscribing. If you click the bell notification, you'll get notified each time I have a new video for you. So just before we go through those 10 myths about watercolour painting, I want to say that these are just my opinions. Obviously, there is no right and wrong with art and everybody has a different opinion. Some of these things I speak about can be very controversial. If anything in watercolour painting could be said to be controversial. So these are just my opinions from sort of decades of working in the medium and teaching the medium, but that doesn't mean that I'm right about everything. If you think something different, feel free to let me know in the comments. So myth number one about watercolour paintings: they're really weak looking and kind of wishy-washy. Well, that's just not true. Now, if you understand about watercolour paint itself, you'll understand that it's simply pure pigment and binder, so it can be as bright and colourful as any other medium, including things like oils. So if you see watercolour paintings and they are a bit weak and a bit insubstantial, there's only really two reasons for that. The first reason is that the artist just hasn't applied the paint properly. The second reason is that the paints themselves are cheap paints. They're full of fillers and bulking agents and white paint, and they're just not a good enough quality to get that lovely, bright, strong colour. And I'll drop another one of my paintings in right now so you can have a look at that. And I think you'll agree that watercolour paintings can really be incredibly bright. Myth number two is that only transparent watercolours are proper watercolours. That's proper watercolour painting. Introducing mixed media and white paint just simply isn't watercolour. Now, this is kind of true and false, so I do have sympathy with this point of view, and certainly if you're starting to use watercolours, it's really best that you use them on their own as a transparent medium without introducing things like white paint, which will only confuse you, because really the white in watercolours should be the white of the paper. However, people that get too absolutely purist about transparent colours don't seem to remember that the very earliest watercolourists, including people like Turner, regularly used white paint and body colour. And even modern watercolours, there are transparent colours, but they're also semi-opaque colours. Now, some watercolourists avoid these. I don't mind them. So it's true that you should use watercolour in a transparent way, particularly when you're a beginner, and that white paint would nowadays be considered mixed media. However, remember that the earliest watercolourists were not purists at all, and they did use white paint. So myth number three, and this is one of the most commonest things said about watercolour, is, oh, well, you can't correct mistakes. Once you've done something, you're stuck with it. That's what makes watercolours so difficult. Well, I'm afraid this simply isn't true. There are multiple ways of correcting watercolour mistakes even after the paint's dry. So I did a whole video on it. I'll link to that up in the information card. You can click on that. You won't go off of this video. It'll just line it up for you to watch afterwards. And if you watch that video, you'll see how many ways there are of adjusting watercolour paint. Now, the reason this myth exists is that certainly paper is a lot more fragile than things like canvas. And I once sat in a friend's studio painting. I was painting watercolours. He was painting oils. Very good artist. He was painting a portrait, not happy with it. He just kept scraping it off and putting it back on the palette and starting again. Well, it's true, you can't do that with watercolours. That doesn't mean there's no adjustments that you can make and no corrections you can make whatsoever. There does come a certain point where you can't do much more to the paper, but you know, there are always acrylics, there's always collage. I've seen all sorts of creative ways that watercolours have been used, and if the painting itself is really that awful, I've seen people crop, I've seen people cut them up and use them for greetings cards or smaller paintings. So don't be thinking that there's nothing you can do about mistakes, because there really are lots of things you can do to correct your watercolours. So myth number four is that watercolours are worth less than oils. So watercolour paintings, if you sell them in a gallery, they're worth less than oil paintings. Now, this is kind of true and kind of false. Certainly, historically, oil paintings have always been worth more. They've been considered that they are done by more professional artists, and this goes back to Victorian times when every amateur in the world, you know, and every lady was taught to paint watercolour paintings unless they came from a very poor background. So it's been associated with amateurs. It's also been associated with the fact that the paper is more fragile and not as long lasting. However, that's kind of historical. Certainly in good galleries now, you may find that watercolours are worth a little bit less than things like oil paintings. But things definitely are changing. Now, if you consider that one of the highest paid artists in the world is Banksy, he spray paints on the outsides of buildings. Then there are people like Tracy Emin who are using sort of household, detritus to make artwork. So the medium is no longer as important as it was before. And if you're just starting out, if you're right at the bottom end of the scale, your watercolours aren't really going to be worth more or less than an amateur oil painter, for example. Certainly at that mid-range where you're charging, a few $100s, a few £100 for your work, there may be a slight increase in how much oil paintings are worth and how much a gallery can sell them for. But once you get to that upper end where people actually become famous, if a famous artist paints a watercolour, it's likely to be worth just as much as his oils. So myth number 5 is that you will never get a good result using students' quality watercolours. Well, this just isn't true either, and it annoys me a little bit because the people that say it, they go onto these Facebook forums and beginners come on and they say, well, I've got these paints, and someone says, oh, well, they're students' quality, you can't paint with those, you must have the best paints. Well, it's just nonsense. When you start out, you're going to be making a huge amount of mistakes. Of course, you do not want really cheap paints, and I'm not advocating for cheap paints. They will really, really hold you back. However, students' qualities of good named brands are pretty much almost as good as artist qualities. Certainly there's a little bit of difference, but you're not going to notice it at the beginning. And if you don't have a huge budget, they can be a real boon. Now, I know for certain that the students' quality are okay because on 2 occasions I've been asked by manufacturers to test them out, or by, I say manufacturers, I should say people that sell the paints to test them out. So the 2 paints I tested were SAA watercolours and also White Nights by St. Petersburg, both of which would be considered, SAA say that their paints are professional. I would kind of disagree. I would say that they're somewhere between a professional and a student's range. Now, if you haven't heard of them, that's because they're a UK brand. The other brand, White Nights by St. Petersburg, they're definitely considered to be a student's range, but they're very, very strongly pigmented. Now, I painted 2 paintings. I painted a Roman ruin in Italy with the St. Petersburg White Nights paints, and I painted a peach poppy with SAA paints. And you can see I got on perfectly well with them. I was probably painting on practice paper too. So this idea that you can only start and get some kind of good result with something like, £15 a tube Daniel Smith watercolours is not true. Daniel Smith paints are great. However, so if you haven't got much money, start with the student's quality. And what I say is start with the student's quality, and when you need to replace 1 tube, then bring in an artist's quality. It's much easier to work your way up that way because some of the paints are weak and some of them are strong, so they won't all run out at once. You might, for instance, run out of lemon yellow first of all. So you can just replace your student's quality with an artist's quality on that one occasion because it's fairly easy usually to find, to find £15. It may not be easy to find £150. So if you want to start with a student set of watercolour paints and then grade them up or even stick with them, it's absolutely fine, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Now, let me be absolutely clear, I'm not talking about basic unnamed drugstore paints, which are appalling and you will get a terrible result if you use them. I'm talking about named brands, for instance, White Nights St. Petersburg, SAA, Winsor & Newton Cotman, Talon's Van Gogh. These are all very good students' quality paints and you'll get on perfectly fine with them. They're a really nice quality. So myth number 6 is that you must use a Kolinsky Sable brush. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Actually supports the fur trade. So a Kolinsky Sable is not just a name, it's an animal, and it's not a byproduct of the meat trade either. It's an animal that is killed for its fur, and the tail of the animal is taken for watercolour brushes. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want anything to do with that sort of thing. And the truth is as well, I have tried Kolinsky Sable brushes years ago before I understood what they were, and I found them a bit too soft, to be honest. I actually prefer painting with a synthetic brush. Now, even if you do like an animal fur brush, you'll find that they have made synthetic copies now which are just as good. Of course, there's there's a discussion to be had about plastic pollution and all of that. So there is no good answer for watercolor brushes. But to say that you can only get a good result with a Kolinsky Sable is absolute nonsense. I haven't used one. I've been painting watercolors and selling watercolor paintings for over 15 years now, and I don't have any Kolinsky Sable brushes except perhaps one, which is I think I've got one very old squirrel hairbrush as well. I rarely use them because I just find them a bit soft and floppy, to be honest. However, if you already own Kolinsky Sable and you get on with it, for goodness sake, don't throw it in the bin, because there's nothing more detrimental to the environment than throwing things away that are perfectly useful. So if you've got one of these brushes, if you didn't know what it was, don't beat yourself up. You own something, just keep using it. So myth number 7 is that you don't need to stretch your paper. It's time consuming and fiddly, and it's pretty pointless. It doesn't make much difference. Now, when I say, people say you don't need to stretch your watercolor paper, it's true from the point that, well, you don't. You don't need to do anything. I don't need to have a shower every day, but I do. I don't need to paint my nails. I don't need to clean my car. Probably don't need to feed my cat. You can use the term "don't need" about anything, but of course there are things that are advantageous for us to do. Now, I can only give you my opinion on this, and it is controversial. You'll find so many people online saying don't bother stretching your watercolour paper. Now, I think for a lot of them, it's just a fact that they've got in their head that it's a really complex and time-consuming thing to do. Now, I've got a couple of videos about why you should stretch your watercolour paper, and I've also got a video that will explain to you in depth exactly how to do it, and I'll link to that video up in the information cards at the top there. Now, the video is maybe 20 minutes long because it goes through every step of stretching your paper in detail, but that doesn't mean that once you've learned to stretch your paper, it's going to take you that long. Seriously, I could do it in maybe a minute and a half. It's very, very little effort. Now, I'm not here to tell you you must stretch your watercolour paper. If it's going to impede your enjoyment of the medium and the fact that you just will not get on with doing some painting, then by all means, don't stretch your watercolour paper. But all I can tell you is that in my years of experience, it's absolutely the best surface to work on. Not only will it leave your painting dead flat at the end, but it actually improves the way you apply the paint, because your paper will wrinkle less and the paint won't sit in puddles, which leads to uneven drying. So, true and false. No, you don't have to stretch your watercolour painting paper, and I'm not going to make you. But do I think you should do it? Yes, I do. So myth number 8 goes that you should start your watercolour painting with an all-over wash of colour. Now, this is a huge mistake that I see so many beginners making. Now, I'm not saying it's never appropriate. Maybe one painting in 100 might have the colours and the layers that would be appropriate for putting a wash of paint down all over your paper to start with, but that's very few. And to be honest, you have to remember that watercolour is a transparent medium. Any colour that you put down at the start is going to affect every other colour you lay on top of it, and particularly for things like flower painting, where you might have some beautiful bright, say bright pink or bright purple petals. The last thing you want is any other colours sitting underneath that bright petal colour. So once you've laid that wash of paint all over your paper, you've knocked out all of the white paper. You can no longer get that white paper back, and any colour that you put on top is going to be polluted, or at least layered with that initial colour. So I suggest that unless it's absolutely appropriate for the picture that you're painting, and that's going to be very few of them, don't start with an overall wash of paint on your paper. So myth number 9 is that dark colours must be built up in layers. Now, I think there's a bit of confusion here, because I think people are confusing this idea with working light to dark, which you absolutely should do. So you certainly shouldn't put your dark colours in until the latest part of the painting that you can. You should start with the lighter colours and work up to the dark colours. But if you have got an area that is just dark, there is absolutely no reason why you have to work that up in 6 different layers of paint instead of just sticking the dark paint straight on. In fact, it can actually make your paintings a bit muddier, and it can certainly lead to things like very, very fluffy edges. Now, I've got a video that shows you how to put dark shadows in at the end of your painting and talks more about this. I'll link to that up in the top and you can have a look at that. But remember, you don't have to build up in layers. Yes, you should work light to dark, and no, you shouldn't put darks in right at the beginning, apart from anything else that they tend to smudge. So put them in at the end, but you do not have to work them up in layers. If something is dark, just paint it dark with very strong paint. So myth number 10, watercolour is the most difficult, it's the hardest of all the mediums to master. So, well, you know, true and false. I never found it that difficult. I took to it straight away. So there are things in life that you take to, and there are things in life that you don't take to. Certainly as a complete beginner, it can seem more difficult because it's a lot more technique-led. You need to learn some techniques. You can't just sort of throw the paint on the paper like you do with acrylics and it stays put. But I really think there are difficulties and challenges in any medium. And let's go beyond that. Let's consider whether it's a hard medium or an easy medium. Does that actually matter? If you love the look of watercolour paintings, if you really want to get to grip with it, does it matter if it's hard, if it's easy, if you initially find it difficult or not? You know, just get on with doing it if you enjoy doing it. Now, one of the things that I do outside of painting is martial arts. So in fact, I do lots of fitness stuff. I do yoga and Tai Chi and just tons and tons of fitness stuff. But the thing I love the most is martial arts, and I took up Kung Fu when I was 45 years old. Is this a good idea? Probably not. I'm also very small built. I consistently get knocked around. In fact, you can't see because I'm wearing long sleeves. See if I can get you to see. There you go. Nice big bruise on my arm. Is Kung Fu an advisable thing to do when you are over 50 and of a very small build? Probably not. I've even had things like broken ribs. But the truth is, I absolutely love it. Now, I'm not fantastic at it, but I've stuck at it. I've stuck at it and tried really, really hard. And I passed last year my 5th grading exam in Kung Fu. So whether or not something's easy or difficult, you know, it's all a matter of personal application and personal ability. And there may be certain parts of watercolour painting that you are good at and certain parts of it that you are bad at. There will be ways of using the medium that you're good at and bad at. Perhaps you're good at studio painting like me and not so good painting outdoors. Maybe it's the other way around. Perhaps you're good at the drawing part of it. Perhaps you're not. You know, you really can't quantify a single, a big subject like art or martial arts. You can't quantify it down to one skill. There are certain things in martial arts that I'm not as great at because my knees aren't so good anymore, and as I said, I'm not physically as strong as some people. But there are other things that I'm much better at. I'm pretty good at learning the Chinese terms. Other people struggle with it. So there'll always be a part of a skill which you are good at and better than other people at, and you have to play to those things. And the things that you are not so good at, you just have to work hard and do your best at. So just because somebody says that watercolour painting is the hardest medium, truth is that's just their personal opinion and it's their experience of it. And the other truth is that it doesn't matter. If you like watercolour painting, just keep going. So do you agree or disagree with the things I've spoken about today? Or has it just given you a new perspective on some of the things that people say all the time about watercolour painting? Please do hit the like button, share this video if you found it useful so other people can watch it too, and you can watch another one of my videos right now.